Welcome everyone. We'll give it another minute or so. Feel free to put your cameras on if you'd like, otherwise you can leave them off. I think we'll get started because we haven't got a lot of time. So welcome, I'm Cara Brosnahan. So I will be taking you through the year 1 and year 2 update of the sheep poo study. We also have with us the rest of the team here. So we've got Dion, who is program coordinator. We've got Lucas, who's the program manager for the EFEI program. We've got Becky Diamond, who's the engagement lead for the facial eczema program. And we've got Susie Keeling, who's the head of science and research. And we've also got Jenny Dudunsky with us today, who is the Wormwise program manager, but also just all-knowing vet. So she'll be here to answer your questions as well. So first of all, I just want to say a huge thank you to you for being sheep poo collectors and being involved in this study, but also taking time to come along to this webinar now or for listening to it later. We really couldn't do it without you, and it's such an exciting piece of work. A little bit of housekeeping. So yeah, camera, feel free to leave that on or turn it off, and it's this little icon in the green triangle here if you want to turn it on or off.
I can't see your slides. I'm not sure if anybody else can see them, or is it just me?
How's everyone looking for seeing the slides?
Yeah, I can see them.
Okay.
Yep,
excellent.
I can see them.
Just you, Susie.
Weird. Continue. Sorry, Cara.
So yeah, microphones, if you're not speaking, if you could just turn those off with that icon in the yellow circle, just so we don't get any background noise. And then if you want to ask a question during the webinar, if you're on a phone or tablet, there's 3 little dots. And if you click on that, you'll be able to see a Q&A icon. And so you can click on that and enter your question in. But if you are on a laptop, then you'll see the icon up the top. So hopefully that works for everybody. But yeah, feel free to put anything you want answered in the chat as we go along. I think that was all for housekeeping. Oh, and the webinar will be recorded, as I said, so it will be made publicly available after this webinar. So I just wanted to first of all go through setting the scene of the wider facial eczema program that Beef+Lamb is leading, and so you know where the sheep poo study fits in. So this is a 7-year research program with co-funding from the government. So Beef+Lamb are contributing 9 million over the 7 years, and Ministry for Primary Industries contributing 8.3 million, and the rest of the money is coming through in-kind contributions from farmers like yourselves and other industry partners. So down the bottom of the slide here, we've got the other industry partners that are contributing to the study. So it's really great to have that cross-sector approach to this program because it is such an important problem for the industry. So we've got 5 different work streams within the program, and the sheep poo study fits into the first one, which is about understanding the basics. So really going back to what we think we know and testing that so that we can then provide better tools and information to farmers. We also, in understanding the basics, have a project on looking at the fungus itself associated with facial eczema, and work that we've done over the last couple of years with Ag Research and Manaaki Whenua have shown there are different species and with different abilities to produce the toxin or not. So this information will be really important as we go along in this sheep poo study to try and actually tease that out and understand where those toxic species are. So these samples that you are providing to us will be kept and stored to understand that better. And the other work stream, I won't go through all of them, but obviously happy to chat about the whole program if you have questions. But really just wanted to draw your attention to this discovering tools and solutions. So a big part of the program is, if we understand these basics really well, providing other tools and solutions to manage facial eczema. And we've got a few projects underway, and these are the general categories that they're in, and it's providing both pasture and animal-based management tools. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at a broad approach of seeing what would work for farmers, what looks robust scientifically, and what would be cost effective, and then certain ones that are looking promising would go through to a development stage. So it's not going to happen overnight, but just so you know that this work is in progress and we are working really hard to get some better tools for this disease. Right, the sheep poo study. So a little bit about why we're doing this. One is to know where the fungus associated with facial eczema is in New Zealand, and we're doing that by looking at the spores coming from the fecal samples you are submitting. We also want to document and understand the level of clinical and subclinical facial eczema outbreaks, so those that you see and those that you don't necessarily see in your animals. Also looking at other risk factors for facial eczema. So why does this actually occur? We know a lot of things about the fungus, so we know that temperature and moisture are really important, but are there other things that we haven't considered that we could be using for a preventative management approach? And we'll also be using this data to develop a predictive model for facial eczema. And we've got some great partners working on the sheep poo study. So Kevin Lawrence from Massey University, who I think might be here today, and Tom Brownlee from Ingenum, who is here. So they're working, they've been involved in the study right from the start and involved in the analysis. And obviously Awanui labs are doing all the testing, so that's where you're sending all your samples to. And Metservice are contributing all the meteorological data for the predictive model to understand this better. And as a recap, so year one, we had the fortnightly sheep poo collection, and as we're doing this year as well. So you're sending in your sheep poo sample, but we're also asking for a lot of information about the sample. So about the pasture height and type, the GPS location, about your sheep, the altitude, if you've got irrigation or not. And so all of this information feeds into the analysis that Tom and his team at Ingenum are doing. And today I'm just going to be providing some initial insights because there's still a lot more analysis to do. And obviously over the 3 years, that's where the real power will come in for this study. We are also doing some animal sampling. So last year when sheep poo samples came back and they were over 100,000 spores per gram, we selected some farms to go out to and do some extra testing. So that was blood testing and fecal samples from the same animal, and we did 10 animals from the mob, and also the pasture sample so we could see if there were spores actually in the paddock as well. And did this with clinical animals as well. And this was really to understand or make sure that we are defining a case of facial eczema the same way across the board. So we'll be doing this for the 3 years as well. So year one, the locations where farms were contributing to the study are here in the green dots from the North to the South Island. So we had a good spread, but obviously more in the North Island, which you'd probably expect. And just as an illustration, we've got these 2 red dots out in the sea. This is just to highlight that it's really important that we get the GPS location from you so that we don't have samples that are outside of a landmass, which I'm pretty sure that's not where the sheep are grazing. But the good news is, and I'll talk about this later as well, but if we have that GPS location, then we don't have to have the altitude and the aspect from you. So that's 2 less fields for you to fill in the submission form. And Tom and his team can get that information from the GPS coordinate. So that's a good start. And the farm information, so this all came from either the start of season or the end of season surveys that you completed. And this just gives an idea of where the farms were spread and what kind of farms are participating in the study last year. So the median farm size was 413 hectares. So that is if you laid all the data out, that midpoint. The stocking rate, 12 stocking units per hectare, and the age of the sheep that were sampled were on average a year old. And in terms of where the farms were, the farm class, the North Island Hill Country were the most dominant in the study, followed by South Island finishing breeding, and then going down for those other classes. So it's nice to see that mix of different farms as well, or farm classes. In terms of the pasture, these were grouped into these categories, and as you can see, ryegrass-based pastures were the most dominant, where the animals were grazing, and other was quite big as well. Other was things like kikuyu or other mixes. For the pasture where we saw clinical signs of EFEI, or where you reported clinical signs of EFEI, was in ryegrass-based pastures, which is what we would expect because they are higher risk. But there were also clinical cases in other pastures, so mixed pastures, hill country, and that other, which one of those was a kikuyu clover mix. So yeah, I guess it's important to know that yes, pastures can be safer than others, but they still may contain spores and may cause damage. Most of the pasture was over 3 years old. Obviously, some of that was ranging up to very old, or old as, I think, was some of them. And a range of different aspects that the animals were grazing on. And predominantly, there was no irrigation on the farm sampled, which is also probably unsurprising. I've just got a link down here, which we can also send you, is just a reminder that we've recently put out a new fact sheet of those different pastures, the safer pastures. So yeah, we can send that to you in a separate email. The fecal spore counts. So when we saw them, the mean was 32,000. So, you know, when we're spread out, it's relatively low, but they did get quite high, up to about 1 million spores per gram. The pasture height where people were grazing was around 5 centimetres was the mean, but obviously we had ones that were over 15 centimetres as well. And then the altitude was on average 200 metres above sea level. And where we saw spores last year, pretty much everywhere we looked. So, and the red is obviously more spores that we saw and higher levels, and then they got gradually less as we went down the country. But we did see spores in North Canterbury, Southland and Otago, but they were very, not many farms, and the further down you got down the country, there were less farms and they weren't very high numbers, but it's still very interesting to know that they were found, and we're working through what species they are so we can get more information about that and that risk to farmers. So we had a range of different sheep breeds in the study, predominantly Romney, and then other was the next. So again, we had to kind of categorize them into something that made sense. So, you know, the dairy sheep, for example, will be in other. And yeah, going down to some of these breeds of sheep, we didn't have many representative mobs at all, but we put the number of clinical cases that were reported beside these with a percent of how many mobs. And the number of clinical cases, oh yeah, thanks for the clarification there. The number of clinical cases is a clinical case, you're saying the mob is affected. So just a word of caution that these breeds down here, we can't read too much into this because there are very few numbers in the study. So we can't say that, Dorset are very susceptible, for example, but over 3 years, we might get a better picture of that. And here is where the clinical cases were reported. So this is over time, you'll see little blue dots come up. And so this is from December to May, where those clinical EFEI cases were reported. So as you can see, they're starting on that west coast early in the season, and throughout the time there's more over the North Island and the top of the South Island. And the deep blue is there are less cases, up into the yellow, which there are more cases being reported. And this is not necessarily at a farm level. It is, if there were two mobs close together, they will be considered one. And I will just, if this works. So here is a static map of that. So that was showing, that animation was showing over time, but this is the static map of those clinical cases that were reported. And as I said, there are from the top of the South Island to the top of the North, they were reported throughout with more intensity in the Waikato King Country area. And in terms of looking at the GGT levels, these are the animals we went out to sample when the spore counts got over 100,000. Went out and tested 10 from that mob. And here is an animation of what that looks like over time. Got to be quick eyes. I'll put up the static map soon. So again, the darker blue means the GGT levels were not very elevated, whereas the yellow, they were quite elevated. And we sampled from 58 farms, and 35 of those had elevated GGTs. Again, here is the static map. And I just wanted to draw your attention, there is one in Southland. We went to sample this mob of sheep because there was a spore count and there was an animal with an elevated GGT. I don't think this was EFEI, but this is a good example of getting all of the information to diagnose an EFEI case rather than just looking at GGT levels, for example, because GGT is a measure of liver damage, and it is not, EFEI is not the only thing that will raise this level. For example, liver fluke will, and Ginny can talk more about that if we want to have a discussion about it. But it's just a good reminder that we can't just base our results on one measurement. So in terms of the key findings so far, we found spores throughout New Zealand, which again we're looking into to understand that better and find out what species they are. Elevated GGTs doesn't always mean facial eczema, but it is a great measure when you have all that other information with you. There was a 12% prevalence of clinical facial eczema reported from the people submitting the samples, and spores were seen from January to June, which is, it's quite a long period of the year where spores are around and potentially exposing animals. So year 2, again, doing the fortnightly sheep poo collection, but as I said earlier, the good thing is that you now can leave off 2 more fields in your submission form. So the aspect and altitude, we can get that from the GPS location, but feel free to write them in if you would like to. Again, we're going to be doing the animal sampling from up to 70 farms for the subclinical signs and up to 30 farms for the clinical. And we've also got another study within year 2, which is called the nested study. Oh, I think someone's got their microphone on. Let's be muted now. So yeah, up to 40 farms. They are in areas where they either had clinical facial eczema last year or they had high spore counts but didn't have facial eczema signs that they saw. And 35 animals from one mob of sheep will be tagged, and every 2 weeks the animals will be weighed. A blood sample will be taken and a fecal sample will be taken from each animal. and a pasture sample will be taken from where the animals are currently grazing. So this is to quantify the exposure to the facial eczema spores and the resulting liver damage, to estimate the correlation or the relationship between the spore counts both in the pasture and the feces, and also how that's related to the GGT, to provide more accuracy for understanding how you can define a facial eczema case. And also this information will help provide input into that predictive model for facial eczema as well. We'll also be testing those definitions of how we're saying, yes, this is a facial eczema case, this is spring eczema, whatever it might be, testing that with these animals as well, so we get a really clear picture of how we are diagnosing a facial eczema case. And so far for year 2, we've had 289 farms sign up and 254 farms that have submitted samples already, and almost 1,000 results have gone out. And interestingly, we've seen 3 farms come back with spore counts from 3 different regions. So in the Wellington region, the Waikato and Auckland. We're following up with those again to try and understand what they are. Are they a toxic species? Are they a non-toxic species? Or, is there something else going on in the environment that we need to know about? Traditionally, people don't start spore counting until January, so this is very early, and this is what we wanted to do, to really understand what's going on before January hits. So this is great information, or it will be great information once we find out more. And there have already been multiple reports of clinical EFEI as well through your submission forms. People have noted that. So it might be a very different year to last year, which didn't seem to be a very bad EFEI year, but we'll see what happens this year. And I guess that's a good point as well, as why we're doing it over 3 years, because as you all know, it's very variable from season to season, which is why we need this information over time. All right, so that was all I wanted to go over, and would like the remaining time for questions and discussion. We did have a few questions sent through from when people registered, so happy to go over those, and then we can get into any questions that you've got. If you would like, you can also just put your hand up and ask a question. I'm sure we can do that, eh, Dion? The technology, we have the technology. So if we go through these questions first, so if my pasture is older than the first recorded cases of EFEI in New Zealand, is it safe? This is a really great question, and I will throw to Ginny as well. But from my point of view, because it is a fungus, it's environmental, it's very hard to keep out of a specific area. I would say that no, it's not safe, but I will let Ginny answer that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Cara. I just answer from a practical perspective, having seen EFEI in various North Island locations that I've worked. While it does seem to be more prevalent on ryegrass pastures, I've certainly seen plenty of clinical cases of EFEI on older native pasture, brown top pasture, unimproved pasture, which I presume is the sort of pasture that the question is referring to. So I think no is the answer.
Right. And the next one, keen to know what breed of sheep is being tested. So we did have a slide on that, so hopefully that has answered your question there. Does pasture species impact spore count? So yes, it does. And I've just got, so this is the information that we'll be sending out. We recently put together these, well, Becky Diamond and our team did, showing those safer pastures or lower risk, and then the moderate to high risk pastures. So as I said earlier as well, we'll send that information around to you. And can you alert us to when various areas are getting positive EFEI results so we can be forewarned? Yes, so we have a couple of ways of doing that. So there is a GIS viewer that will be up and running. Correct me if I'm wrong, Lucas, it's not running yet for this year.
Yeah, that's right. Just figuring out a couple more technical things and then it'll be good to go.
Cool. So yeah, once we get that, we'll send through the link. Each time we send out results, we'll put that link in the email so that you've got it at your fingertips, and that will show you in your region where spore counts are happening. The other option is we have a text alert service that you can sign up to, and that gets information from the regional pasture spore counts that are done around the country, and will send you information about your region if the counts are getting up there. So again, we can send out the information of how to sign up for that text as well. So hopefully that helps. Right, were there any questions so far in the Q&A? Let me have a look.
There is a question there, Cara, from Duncan.
So does fertilizer type impact spore production? I don't know, Ginny, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I can answer it with the limited science that has been done. There was a case from a farm sort of up the Bay of Plenty or East Waikato a few years ago that a girl reported at, I think, Grasslands or Society of Animal Production, where that farm had had a lot of lime applied and appeared to have lower spore counts on the lime applied areas. It was something like that anyway. But then when that was looked at in like a replicated way where, parts of paddocks were treated and then not treated, they weren't able to find any difference from the lime application. But that kind of science was only done over quite a short period. So I do hear that from farmers anecdotally quite a lot, that farms that apply lime regularly or products that have extra calcium in them regularly feel like they get less eczema. I'm not sure if it's if we've really managed to quantify that. But yeah, the answer at the moment is no, but it's probably still a bit open.
Yeah, so that's a good segue into what we're looking at in the program. We will be looking initially in the lab at the different species and how they react to different minerals, and yeah, looking at whether fertilizer is something we should also be looking into. So that is on the cards for the program, because as Ginny's just shown, there's not a lot of conclusive data out there at the moment. Thanks for your question. Wendy.
Yeah, hi guys, thanks for this. Hey, early days, but were you able to pick up any correlations from the extra testing you did last year, between the pasture samples, blood tests and the poo tests? Are we starting to see a pattern of similarity, or was it too soon?
Yeah, it is too soon for that, and I don't know if Tom or Kevin wanted to comment, but yeah, it is a bit too soon. It wasn't anything clear cut, let's say that. But the more animals we get, and over those 3 years, will give us a lot more data to be able to say that for sure. Yeah. The other thing, while we are waiting for more questions, is I will hand over to Ginny to talk about livers.
Cool. Yeah, so I guess something I was wanting to highlight for people is coming up, you're either just weaning now, or you might have weaned, or if you're a bit further south, maybe weaning in January. It's a really, really good time to look at the livers of some tail end ewes. If you've usually got some ewes on the farm that can go on a truck, and you might have others that really can't. Those ones that can't go on a truck, rather than just throwing them down a hole without having a look first, it's a really good thing to have a check of the livers of those ewes, which you can do quite quickly with a sort of quick on-farm post-mortem. There's an image up there of some quite scarred livers against the wall in that photo, and then some more normal but smaller looking livers at the bottom left of that photograph. And if you want a better tutorial on this, if you go on the EFEI Gold social media or website. There's a video up there going through a series of livers from more scarred to less scarred. And obviously, if you're seeing those ones over on the right with the altered shape and the fatness and the white in them, and when you cut into those, like, it feels different with your knife. It's harder and you can feel it's almost sort of gritty when your knife goes through, whereas a nice soft healthy liver is a lot a lot softer. So this is a good time to look for those, or if it's not something you want to do yourself, it's a really good investment actually if you've got a vet in your area who's good with sheep. Get out and do some postmortems of those ewes, because they'll not only pick up how much eczema challenge those ewes have been under, but they can also pick up things like Johne's disease, how much parasitism's there, things like tooth abnormalities that you might not notice from looking at a live animal. Intestinal cancer and viral pneumonia are all things that you can pick up and kind of rank in a flock as to what effect they're having, and sometimes that can lead to some management changes.
Wonderful. We've also got another question from Bridget, which is a great question. What is the difference between spring and facial eczema? And I'm certainly going to hand over to the vet for this one.
Yeah, so I mean, if we're talking sheep or cattle, I guess spring eczema, classically we see that in cattle, and often the dairy breed cattle, or the ones with white patches, where all of a sudden, usually they're on lush spring feed, and all of a sudden one or two individuals will get really sensitive to the light. They'll kick the cups off while they're milking, they'll behave really strangely, they might look lame, they might be just running and trying to find shade because they're so irritated. And in the acute phase, you won't see much at all other than this strange behaviour, but then over the next few days you start to see the skin reddening up, and then it will peel. So that's a reaction to a lot of chlorophyll or green pigment that's in the grass. And there's a guy at Massey called Mark Collett who's been working on this his entire career. And he still hasn't come up with a clear answer as to why these sporadic cases occur. Another example of that would be where we just get this sudden photosensitivity in a small number of lambs, usually between docking or tailing and weaning. And various pasture plants have been implicated in that. All sorts of different weeds, even some of the clovers like white clover has been associated with lambs grazing high quantities of that, and they break out with what looks like sunburn. And those of you who finish lambs on brassica crops will have sometimes seen sunburn in lambs too. So again, it's these plant pigments kind of stirring up the lamb's system, or there are plant pigments that the system isn't processing quickly enough, so they stay in the blood, react with the sunlight, and then you end up with these lambs with sunburn. But that is different to like chronic facial eczema or delayed facial eczema that we see in ewes in the spring, where they will pack up, look crook, all of a sudden crash. They might have a lamb at foot, or they might be just about to lamb. Some of them will just die without any signs, but others will actually break out with sunburn and photosensitivity and swollen ears and all the classic signs of what you would associate with facial eczema in the autumn, but it's happening in the spring. And that's just those ewes that have had ongoing exposure to eczema over several seasons. And I've even seen it. One of my hoggets lambing one year actually died like this. She must have had a bad dose of it in the autumn, which wasn't seen. It was subclinical. And then when she had her lamb, she packed up. She had this tiny little lamb, so it must have affected her pregnancy as well. And then just totally packed up with sunburn, and post-mortem to her, and her liver was really nasty. So it's amazing how that can happen in the spring without having seen anything previous autumn. I was really surprised by that myself. So yeah, that's kind of delayed facial eczema in the spring that you'll see in ewes, which is different to spring eczema in those younger animals or cattle, if that makes sense.
So easy. And with the spring eczema, like that causes liver damage as well? Is that not?
I don't believe if it does, it might cause some temporary alterations in some of the blood markers, but it's not a permanent kind of liver damage. And it is more, it's more pigments in the blood causing a direct reaction under the skin of photosensitivity rather than it being a liver driven thing, if that makes sense, other than that the liver hasn't processed all the pigments, but it's not due to liver damage. I hope I've got that right. So someone more knowledgeable might listen to this webinar and jump in and tell me I've got it all wrong, but I'm pretty sure I've got that sorted.
Thanks, Jenny. Were there any other questions? I can't see any in the chat. Don't think anyone's got their hand up.
Oh, I just had one for you, Cara, which was I see in those classifications of pasture type.
Yes.
There's like unimproved and native, and there was something else that all to me could have been the same type of pasture. I'm just interested if you can provide any clarification on that at all.
So this was based on the responses we got from the participants. So it would be really, so it would be great to hear from the people filling out the forms as well, if we could group them in, because as you say, native or unimproved, maybe they're the same, and we could classify them that way. Yeah. So
and the ditto brown top. I mean, when you walk through a hill country pasture that's brown top dominant, there's many species in there of, I presume, native grasses and unimproved species, but we call it, there's brown top in there, so we call it brown top.
Exactly. So that's a tricky one. So keen if any of the participants have a better way of classifying things, or if there's something we can do to make it easier, then we're all ears as well. The only other thing I wanted to mention, if we don't have any other questions. Oh, yeah, Tom's happy to provide the list to you, Jenny. There's going to be, as part of the program in the Understanding the Impacts workstream, which is understanding those economic and social impacts to the farmers from facial eczema, there'll be 2 surveys coming out in the new year. So just a heads up, if you do want to contribute to that research as well, we will be sending the link around. It's absolutely not compulsory, but if you'd like to contribute, then we'd love to hear from you. So there will be 2 surveys coming out in the new year. I think it is everything, unless someone would want to put their hand up and ask a question. But and generally, if there is anything that you want to know about the study, or something's not working with the sampling or anything like that, then please do just get in touch. Generally, you'll be able to get hold of us in some way. WhatsApp, phone, email, something like that.
Cara, we had a question
did I miss
on
it?
registration. Are poop raisins better than soft or runny poop for testing, or doesn't it matter?
Well, I guess they would have different amounts of spores, but I was interested the other day when picking up poo that it's probably a bit of a bias, because people are probably going to want to pick up those harder raisins rather than runny poo. So that is a very interesting question, but we'll take anything. And we don't probably know the ins and outs of what that means in terms of the testing, unless you have any insight into that, Jenny.
I guess the only thing I could compare it to is fecal egg counts, where some countries and some laboratories will correct for fecal moisture, because obviously the more runny the poo is, it is more likely that the eggs will be diluted in runny poo. So I don't know if that's the same with spores, and we don't do it in New Zealand because we think that there's enough variability in fecal egg counting as it is, without trying to kind of correct for something that may or may not be helpful. There's variability in the time of day that you take the samples, and variability of how much animals have been eating as to how concentrated the spores or eggs will be in the poo. So there's probably as many questions as answers to that question.
Definitely. Would there be a preference? The lab might say there's a preference, but I would say No, we would just, take anything that you're sending in, because as Jenny says, we don't have the answers for that, so I don't think we could go one way or the other. Do you think that's fair, Jenny?
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the reasons for having as many data points in the study as possible, right, to get around stuff like that. So, yeah, if we're worried about that kind of variability, go and get your neighbour to put their sheep poos in as well, and we'll just get 600 farms.
Great call. Duncan, you had a question?
Yeah, it's is beef cows less susceptible to facial eczema than sheep? That's the one question. And the second part of that was with part of like your worm management, with your rotating your cattle and your sheep behind each other sort of thing to break that worm thing. Is there any benefit to that in terms of spore count?
Oh, those are two really good questions. Neither, I'm going to stick my neck out and say both cattle are just as susceptible. We don't maybe necessarily see as much disease, and maybe that's because of their grazing behaviour, that they don't nibble down as hard into the base of the pasture as sheep do. But given the data that's out there in terms of facial eczema, subclinical and clinical facial eczema in dairy cattle, they're obviously just as affected by it. I think part of the issue in a lot of parts of New Zealand probably is a lot of the cows are black. So we're definitely seeing and getting liver damage in those black cattle, but it doesn't manifest as clinical facial eczema. I've been involved in a number of cases myself when I was in practice of ill thrifty dark coloured cattle that in the end it turned out to be liver damage from eczema rather than anything else. And Cara and I were given a really cool case study from a student up in the Raglan area with the same stuff, ill thrift and poor performance in some R2 cattle that just turned out to be facial eczema. So yes, they're susceptible, but possibly their grazing behaviour and how they're managed maybe means that we see less clinical cases. Then the question about the rotational grazing and following each other around. Oh, yeah, a little bit hard to answer. Probably it's probably quite a farm dependent thing. And I don't really know, to be honest, Duncan. Yeah, because the fungus is more down in the base or the litter of the pasture. So whichever group of animals is cleaning that up is going to be the one potentially that gets exposed to more spores. But you could sort of see from the anecdote that I've just talked about with cattle that, maybe making the cattle do more of the cleaning up might be safer than making the ewes do more of the cleaning up. But then if you've got highly eczema tolerant ewes, well, they can cope with that too. So I don't know if I've answered the question terribly well. My answer about grazing management when all of these questions come up, though, is do your grazing management for good grazing management and good grass and what those animals need nutritionally, and then worry more about the disease aspects, worry more about managing them sort of at a higher level with the system or whatever. For instance, with worms, having animals in a certain order with the idea of cleaning up worms, if by doing that you're creating a big tail end in the ewes, say, that might be more costly than the worm cleanup that you think that they're doing. So yeah, just be wary of that.
Thanks, Jenny. All right, I think we are out of questions. Was there any last points anyone wanted to raise before we wrap up? Yeah, all good. Well, just thank you very much for joining again. And yeah, if anything comes to you after this webinar as well, feel free to send through an email and we'll get back to you. But Dion will be sending out the link for the webinar and also those extra links that we talked about after this as well. So yeah, thanks very much and have a great day and Christmas.